It's really nice to be here. And yeah, that set up my talk. I'm quite nervous now because you said that I'm going to present some solutions for things. But just as a kind of warning, like there might not be the solutions that you're kind of satisfied with. But anyway, just as a kind of a little warning. So yeah, the talk is about linguistic justice in schools, and just trying to get it to display on here as well. Yeah, the talk is about linguistic justice in schools, centered around deficit thinking, which is perhaps a concept that you're quite familiar with. But perhaps less familiar with is the idea of anti-deficit resistance. So the talk is really in kind of two parts, right? The first part of the talk is really about mapping out the idea of deficit thinking and its relationship to linguistic injustice. And then the second part of the talk is more concerned with struggles for linguistic justice in schools, or what is called anti-deficit resistance. And the work draws on a number of different, like, kind of overlapping projects that I've done, funded by the Spencer Foundation and the British Association of Applied Linguistics. And I guess what's really important to start off with and say is that both of those projects have been done in really close collaboration with practicing teachers, right? We had practicing teachers that were named on the research grant, practicing teachers that were co-producers and co-analyzers of data, teachers that were co-authors of publications that have come out of those projects. So I feel kind of conscious that I'm talking a little bit on teachers' behalf here, but the teachers that I work with are doing their day-to-day job right now in schools, doing the work of linguistic justice. So yeah, I'm representing a body of work that's really done in close collaboration with a group of incredible teachers. So I'm going to start then by just like setting the scene a little bit for you and just kind of painting a picture of what language practices and language ideologies look and feel and indeed sound a little bit like in England's schools. I'm conscious that some of you might not have so much knowledge of the very kind of uniqueness of England's schools in what is a very strange and quite difficult system to work in. And I'm going to recount some fieldwork notes from last year from some ethnographic work that was part of this project. And the part of this project was really looking at how children's language gets very slowly policed over time. So their experiences of language policing that takes place often over multiple years. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a kid called Benjamin. And Benjamin was just the most amazing kid. I spoke to Benjamin quite a lot during these periods of ethnographic fieldwork. So he was a really kind of like focal student, and Benjamin's experiences really is kind of illustrative of some of the broader arguments that I'll make today. So I'm using his example as just one kind of way in to discussing something much, much bigger. He's, of course, just an individual within a much bigger system, but I hope his little story just helps to kind of illustrate some of the core arguments that I'll put forward. So Benjamin was a kid in a school in South Manchester, not too far, actually, from where I live and not too far from the university that I work in Moss Side, which is one of the most economically deprived parts of the city and indeed parts of the UK more broadly. So it's a very, very poor, very, very working class area. It's got a long history of like working class resistance and struggle. And it's a community that's predominantly made up of Black African and Black Caribbean populations. And that was indeed the case of Benjamin, who was a Black Caribbean boy. And during the fieldwork, he was in his 12th and final year of compulsory education. So he was about 15 or 16 at the time of the project. And he was pretty apathetic about school, right? Like he didn't care too much about it. He had an interest in learning and education, but school itself and like the formal structures of school, he wasn't too bothered about. He had these really like high stakes examinations coming up, but he kind of had little interest about them. And one of the things that really came up time and time again in my observations of how teachers interacted and talked about Benjamin, and indeed a bunch of other kids, was the way that they described his language, right? So they would often describe his language in terms of limits and absences and gaps, and really focusing on what his language allegedly lacked. So they talked about his language as being like unsuitable for school, as someone who struggles with standard English, as having gaps in his vocabulary, as lacking in academic language. You get the idea, right? But when I spoke to Benjamin, outside of the kind of formal structures of school, like something very, very different happened, right? This was a kid who obviously did have these remarkable linguistic abilities, but somehow the institutions and the formal structures of school were kind of misperceiving what he was doing with his language. So I'm not criticizing individual teachers here. I think that's really important to stress, but what I am critiquing is a system and a structure and indeed an ideology which positions teachers in certain ways to reproduce these kinds of deficit discourses about kids like Benjamin. Outside of school then, like Benjamin's linguistic creativity and linguistic dexterity was really actually central to his a kind of emerging identity, particularly as a writer. So he'd recently completed a TV script just off his own back, just because he was interested in doing that. And the script was about the intergenerational lives of 4 black families in Britain. And he'd done some really interesting and meticulous research about language and black language styles and black language vernacular, like doing this amazing research to research shifting linguistic styles over time to kind of represent this intergenerational linguistic change that was representative of his community and what he wanted to try and capture on screen in his script. He was also learning Jamaican Creole, so using YouTube, he was doing this kind of self-directed learning, taking this real interest in language. He had a real interest in learning language to forge kind of connections with his ancestors, with his heritage, and really reclaim a core aspect of his heritage that he felt had been indeed eradicated or suppressed or indeed silenced through the formal structures of school. So put simply, like kids like Benjamin had this remarkable linguistic dexterity and creativity, but those skills really went unrecognized and misperceived in the formal structures of school. So the little vignette and the little kind of story about Benjamin really is just a kind of entry point into the core argument that I'll put forward in this talk, that schools, and I'm talking predominantly about schools in England, are spaces that are built on linguistic injustice, right? Linguistic injustice and the stigmatization of marginalized children is hardwired into schools. It's a design feature of schools, but people have always pushed back, and teachers especially have been at central efforts to push back against those ideologies. And so we can imagine and design linguistically just schools which reject dominant ideologies and discourses of deficit that were so prominent in the way that Benjamin was framed. So Benjamin's just an individual, but he was really a product of what's called deficit thinking, right? So deficit thinking, way back in the kind of early 70s with people like by William Ryan and later on Richard Valencia, talk about deficit thinking as in what's called a victim-blaming narrative, right? So a very prominent, very durable, and very stubborn narrative which has persistently framed working class, disabled, racially marginalized people at the margins of our communities as somehow deficient and therefore in need of some kind of remediation or some kind of corrective intervention, especially in how they use language. So deficit thinking assumes then that the root of social injustices and structural inequality lies not within wider systems of oppression, but within the alleged linguistic deficiencies located within marginalized individuals. So deficit thinking, through this victim-blaming narrative, locates individual faults within individuals and deflects attention away from oppressive intersectional structures of marginalization. Deficit thinking, of course, is nothing new. In England, especially, deficit thinking has colonial roots and colonial histories. In many ways, Britain and England is the kind of ground zero of deficit thinking. Think about how European colonizers would regularly perceive and represent the language of indigenous populations as deficient and therefore symptomatic of their alleged subhumanness. So those logics and those ideologies have remained persistent, stubborn, and intact, and very firmly in place over time, especially in places like schools. It's tempting to think of deficit thinking as arriving as this kind of very explicitly violent practice, but often it appears under very benevolent and very kind of philanthropic guises, right, where marginalized communities like Benjamin are told that the modification of their language is something that's going to serve them better and that's in their own interest to do so. It's really important then to note that deficit thinking has always been met with resistance. People just haven't absorbed deficit thinking uncritically, and indeed critical sociolinguistic scholarship must not simply redocument existing harms or what Tuck calls damage-based narratives about marginalized communities, but seek to highlight their linguistic strengths, their linguistic dexterity, and their linguistic creativity, which pushes back against the deficit thinking which shapes their experiences of schools. So anti-deficit resistance then is a really core fundamental part of what's called linguistic justice and linguistic justice efforts. So deficit thinking about language is a central force in the way that linguistic injustice both circulates in society and how it's produced and indeed how it's maintained. Song describes it like this. He says it's a structural form of injustice, and I like that definition because it shifts attention towards structures and systems rather than simply individuals, in which linguistic diversity is perceived as a threat and therefore as something to be eradicated, in which linguistic hierarchies are upheld, and in which the language practices of marginalized communities get devalued, and this is crucial, in the same ways that their lives are devalued more broadly in society. That's really important because it just pushes us to think through this idea that linguistic discrimination is never simply just about language, but is deeply connected to other intersectional forms of oppression and privilege. In schools, then, linguistic injustice materializes through, yes, like very explicit forms of language policing, right, through kind of verbal corrections in the classroom, but that's not the default mode of deficit thinking and linguistic justice in schools. Instead, we want to think about linguistic justice as something that's a very naturalized and very hardwired feature that appears in curricula, pedagogies, assessments, and indeed policies, which are built on dominant ideologies of linguistic deficit, which therefore produces what counts as illegitimate language. So linguistic justice, then, as a counter to linguistic injustice, and I'm drawing upon the work of people like April Baker Bell here, an amazing black feminist linguist working primarily in the US. If you don't know her work, then it's definitely worth checking out. She describes linguistic justice in these kinds of ways. So it's about building critical knowledge about language, yes, to challenge deficit thinking, but crucially make connections between linguistic stigmatization and broader patterns of social discrimination. And this is key, contribute to broader social justice efforts by pushing for the transformation of unjust systems. So note that final clause is really important because it pushes us to deflect our attention away from how people are allegedly not using language properly and towards the way that the systems and policies and ideologies perceive and represent them as inferior and indeed linguistically deficient. Okay, so England. England schools are really weird, right? They have like a kind of particular history about them, a particular profile about them. Schools, as we know, are really institutions that are designed to slot people into categories. There are an efficient means and efficient technology, if you will, for a government to maintain quality control on its people in terms of what knowledge gets learned and whose voices get heard in schools. Previously, I've conceptualized schools in England as kind of spaces of sonic surveillance, right? So the idea that teachers and students are put under various forms of surveillance in school. There was a really nice presentation about surveillance yesterday, where their language is monitored, yes, by broader policies and state design policies, but it's also monitored by themselves, where they're pushed into positions where they have to consistently surveil their own language in order to demonstrate alleged complicity with external factors and ideologies. So England's schools, especially in recent times, are really characterized by very high levels of deprofessionalization. There's a real kind of shift to remove agency and remove power from teachers in the classroom, high levels of performativity where teachers are under various amounts of pressure to demonstrate complicity with external policy mechanisms, and what Diane Rear, the sociologist of education, has called cultures of fear that are built into schools. The last 15 years or so then have really seen a kind of marked return. God, I'm making England's schools sound like great places to work, aren't I? But there are teachers that push back, and that's really important. So England's schools have really seen a kind of return to very punitive and very strict discipline policies, a very nationalistic curricula that's built on these ideas of idealised Britishness, and crucially, a real resurgence of deficit ideologies about language, which often frame the language practices of marginalised people, like Benjamin that I was talking about earlier, as unsuitable for school and therefore in need of some kind of corrective intervention. So language is planned, and indeed inequality is planned as part of that. Let me give you some examples, just to kind of exemplify how these dominant discourses of linguistic deficit circulate in England. So the first one is from a policy document called the Teachers' Standards. This is like a legal document that all teachers have to demonstrate complicity to. So this is noting how when they're teaching, teachers must take responsibility for using the correct use of standard English that gets policed in various ways. Similar, Ofsted, the inspection body for school who regulates school performance, in a policy document of what they call high-performing schools, say that the more able pupils are speaking standard English in school with sound pronunciation and good sense. So note here how where we have these dominant ideologies of standard English being ideologically associated with pedagogical quality, right, the ability to teach well, and indeed intellectual ability. Of course, those things are completely empirically unrelated to someone's ability to use standard English, but they are deeply ideologically related. An example from a very dominant textbook that teachers use in order to manage pupils' behaviour. So this idea that students from low-income backgrounds come from homes that are immersed in low language ability backgrounds. Again, another popular textbook used for teachers, that students come from what are called word-poor backgrounds, and that as a result of that, they're left unable to describe their world. Neil Mercer, a very prominent academic linguist, reproduces deficit thinking in the way that he's talking about low-income homes and the fact that parents are allegedly unable to socialise their children correctly into the language of school. And from a Manchester policy, just next door actually to the school that Benjamin went to, the idea that speaking in standard English equates to high expectations, and that the school expects students to say it like a scholar. I've got no idea what speaking like a scholar means. If anybody can illuminate me, I'll be very pleased to hear. Like, I don't know. Am I speaking like a scholar now? I just don't know. Anyway, so those ideologies of linguistic deficit are very, very prominent. And of course, they then come to take place in classrooms as well. So I'll show you some ethnographic notes from things that I've seen in classrooms as part of that project. So in one school, this comes from Benjamin's school actually, this was kind of laminated onto children's desks, so when they're seating at all times, they have this like constant reminder that when they're contributing to classroom discussion, they must speak in standard English, they must articulate and project and keep eye contact, right? So a good example of sonic surveillance. A very famous case a few years ago, kids turning up at this school in South London were met with these posters that were kind of stuck onto classroom walls that said, well, these words are now banned. So when you enter into the school, you're not allowed to use these words. A word jail, this is something that was, God, these things are crazy, right? This plastered onto a classroom wall, so if students use these allegedly basic words like nice or big or thing or sad, then those are words that were like consigned to the word jail because they weren't deemed to be high quality enough. And the last example is the graveyard of diseased vocabulary, right? So where words go to die. And the words that go to die are words that are deemed to be basic, like happy and sad and big and hot. So you got kids like talking in these really artificial ways, right? Because they were instead living in fear that when they spoke, what the teacher was going to be doing was just policing what they were saying, what they were saying, rather than the content of what they were saying. So you got kids like using these ridiculous synonyms for basic words, rather than really thinking about what they were saying. So just to give you an example. So an amazing book that kind of puts into articulation a little bit of what I'm arguing for here is that this idea of a bounded and fixed language therefore creates this idea of deviation which has to be controlled. So Heller and McIlhenny say, well, one of the things that schools do, and indeed always have done, is they try to socialize speakers out of these practices and into standardized ones. Right? They try to mold them into these kind of categories, or at least get them to reproduce and accept this idea that variability is problematic, even if those behaviors remain unchanged, like they did with Benjamin. I mentioned before then that those ideas often surface under what I'll call very flawed theories of social justice, right? So deficit thinking and some of the things that we've just seen would often get accompanied by these narratives of social equality, right? Where teachers and school leaders and policymakers were reproducing these ideas about language, but saying, well, yeah, but this is a social justice issue, right? This is a social equality issue. Like, kids must change the way that they use language. Kids must use standard English if they're to be able to afford it a route out of the economic discrimination that they experience. So again, from Alex Quigley's book, very, very popular, very, very influential textbook that's used in England, he says there's thousands of small solutions to the damaging inequalities in our society, and they can be found in the English dictionary. So it's like, right, like, I mean, I like dictionaries, right? They're cool, but I'm not sure that they're the answer to social inequalities as is being posed here. Yet those narratives are very, very dominant. So Jonathan Rosa says, well, what we have here is the interpretation of structural inequality being posed as a linguistic problem which requires linguistic solutions, right? Rather than what it actually is, which is a socio-political problem which requires socio-political solutions. So therefore, resisting deficit thinking requires not theories of change which are focused and premised on the modification of individual language practices, but are instead focused on the transformation and indeed the abolition of unjust systems. I'll give you another example. I know the focus of the conference is really about destandardization. So standard English and standard language ideology have been a kind of central force in the way that this narrative has been promoted in England schools as of late. So Sean Harford, he's the guy that's the kind of the chief director of research in Ofsted, the inspection body for schools. He says, well, rather than being seen as a tool to perpetuate class and obviously therefore racial hierarchies, standard English is now regarded as an instrument of social justice, right? So those logics being displayed in very, very powerful means which schools are expected to reproduce themselves. So this is a kind of cartoonish representation of what we have here, right? But this idea that standard English and other forms of dominant language patterns are therefore attractive, and therefore those are the things that policymakers focus on, which deflect attention away from the real root causes of social injustice. So theories of change for linguistic injustice then, well, there are lots of different ones, obviously, that exist across a spectrum. So the most kind of socially reproductive theories of change for linguistic justice are absolutely those ones that dominate schools and dominate education policy, like we've just seen. So theories like assimilation and accommodation are really focused on changing individuals' language practices so that they fit in and they adapt and that they conform with dominant patterns and ways of communicating, right? Change the individual, crucially change the way that the individual uses language in order for them to experience justice. Evolution is a kind of less like socially reproductive form of linguistic justice. You might build in some kind of critical awareness about language, but the logics remain intact, right? You're still prioritizing dominant language patterns as a means to socially reproduce the way that people speak. And then on the other end of the scale, we have more socially transformative theories of change, so transformation or transformative justice, and indeed abolition, which say, no, we should focus our attention less on the way that stigmatized language, that individuals use stigmatized language practices, and instead focus our attention on dismantling entire systems, often from the ground up, and a core part of that is the undoing of dominant language ideologies. So undoing dominant language ideologies then is really a core part of linguistic justice efforts. Language ideologies, we heard some really cool talks about language ideologies at this conference. Obviously big kind of beliefs that circulate about language in schools and society. But the core thing about language ideologies is that they rely on things that are not immediately empirically observable, right? So language ideologies are always products of perception rather than something that's rooted in sociolinguistic reality, producing, as a result of that, imagined signs of pedagogical and intellectual deficiency. So some work that I've done with teachers shows how racially marginalized teachers are often framed through deficit perspectives for their alleged inability to produce standard spoken English, right? So not conforming to state policy, whilst white teachers, local dialect and local vernacular were seen as signs of coolness and relatability. So the same language practices get perceived differently depending on who is doing the listening and who is doing the speaking. What Jonathan Rosa and Nelson Flores call this is the idea of ratiolinguistic ideologies then. So ratiolinguistic ideologies as a subset of language ideologies are those that frame racialized communities as both inherently and perpetually deficient, regardless of what they do with their language, right? No matter what they do with their language, kids like Benjamin in schools, remember that black boy that I opened this talk with, their linguistic abilities will continue to be perceived as deficient, even though what Benjamin was actually doing with his language actually surpassed those of his more privileged, more white peers. But because of his racialized and marginalized status in society, his language got framed as perpetually deficient. So those language ideologies are rarely, if ever, just about language, right? Sometimes they're not even about language at all, but they got co-constructed with other much unrelated traits like intellectual ability and behavior. So some recent work that I did looked at discipline policies in schools. I said earlier that in recent years, England's schools have become spaces where particularly punitive and particularly hostile policies about behavior have really been embedded in schools. So what we did in this work, I built a big corpus of school discipline policies and found that there was a constellation of linguistic features which were empirically distant to the idea of bad behavior, but deeply ideologically connected to constructions of who is a misbehaving child. So in these policies, we found then that the notion of misbehavior, or the notion of what it means to allegedly behave badly in school, is ideologically connected to a whole cluster of linguistic signs, such as non-standard grammar, slang, informal language, basic vocabulary, etc. All of those things, note, that we saw earlier that had been banned and policed in school. Of course, there's nothing empirically connected between a child's ability to behave properly and their ability to use standard spoken English, but according to these policies, there is a deep ideological connection which positions some students as deviant, as linguistically deficient, as intellectually deficient, and therefore in need of control and remediation. So we have these really long histories of deficit thinking, so moving towards how we might start to think back against this then. So there's really long histories of deficit thinking and resistance in England's schools. We noted earlier how deficit thinking, at least in Britain, has its roots in British colonialism and the framing of indigenous languages as closer to animal forms of communication rather than human forms of communication. Those logics persevered and continued into the 1960s. There was a huge scandal in 1960s Britain where black Caribbean children in particular, like Benjamin, were systematically perceived as linguistically inferior and placed into what were called at the time schools for the educationally subnormal, as exposed by black activists, parents, and community groups like Bernard Coard. So at that time, just at the time we have now, those alleged inabilities to use standard English were perceived as their sign of alleged intellectual capacities more broadly. Crucially, though, black communities always pushed back, right? They didn't just take these discourses and those ideas to be fact, but they engaged in critical, anarchist, and abolitionist efforts which designed black-led schools, which took students outside of the mainstream structures of schools in order to provide them the education and the nourishment that they deserved. So those supplementary schools are really important because they give us this idea that dismantling deficit thinking about language is an important way in how children might be reframed as linguistically dexterous and linguistically skillful. So dismantling deficit thinking then is important because it's really important to note that deficit thinking has always been met in parallel, right? It's always been met with resistance. So again, Eve took her work urges us to focus less on damage-centered work, but more on desire-based work. So less work that simply seeks to redocument the pain and the oppression that marginalized people experience, but on work that seeks to highlight their creativity, their dexterity, their power, their agency, and really long history of pushback against dominant language ideologies. The question then that I'll move towards in the second half of this talk then is, well, how might linguists engage in those efforts, right? How might linguists contribute to efforts to dismantle deficit thinking in schools, or where are the cracks in the system, right? A really kind of powerful metaphor that I've used with teachers, where teachers have been using that metaphor to kind of locate and widen little spaces for resistance, right? I hope it's become quite clear that teachers in England work within quite an oppressive system, but there's always spaces for resistance. There's always spaces for critical pushback. So I'm going to draw upon some work that I published with a teacher, practicing teacher Dan, in an article called Teachers Challenging Language Discrimination in Schools. And in this work, we're really focusing on moving towards a typology of resistance, right? So what are the kind of conditions and what are the kind of factors in place that make anti-deficit work possible in schools? So we open that article with framing our commitment to how we perceive linguistic discrimination. So we see it not just as about individual attitudes, which kind of surface in these very individual and very malicious acts of prejudice, but as something more structural, right? As something that's more systemic, something that's more structural, that's underpinned by dominant language ideologies, which rank and organize language varieties and indeed the communities associated with them. We were inspired by some really cool work going on in Spain at the moment, which is engaging in similar efforts. There's a really nice special issue published recently in the International Journal of the Sociology of Language. And again, like we're building on these kinds of ideas, right? We advocate for research that doesn't just describe linguistic-based inequalities, but actively intervenes to address them by engaging communities through participatory work. So the kind of participation that we were doing here with academics working with practicing teachers. So as part of this work then, we built a whole system of things to put linguists and teachers into dialogue and into collaboration with each other. Over the last few years, me and some teachers have been building and practicing what we've called a critical language awareness collective. So this is a group of around 50 teachers or so who meet quite regularly to discuss these critical issues around language, power, and education. And again, like taking lead from some of that work that I've just talked about, a shared motivation for not just documenting deficit thinking about language, but seeking to actively intervene and actively dismantle it. One of the things that we've done then is, and I'll show you an extract of it in a moment, is developed a co-produced manifesto, so like a vision for linguistically just schools and like a blueprint for how we might design linguistically just schools. Some of those teachers are also involved in a summer school on linguistic justice. So for the last few years, we've held one in Manchester, where over 2 to 3 days, we invite teachers with a core theme of linguistic injustice. And the focus of that work is really thinking about how we might work with teachers to incorporate theoretical and critical notions into their practice and adapt their teaching accordingly. So what Freire calls praxis, right? A mix of theoretical and practical aspects. So through both of these collaborations, we've done some in-depth case studies of teachers' work and the kind of classroom practice that they're engaged in the pursuit of linguistic justice, which has resulted in a co-designed blueprint and a framework for what linguistically just schools might look like. So out of that work, we've built this typology of resistance, right? A kind of network of factors which we believe are kind of crucial things in linguistic justice efforts. So I'll talk through some of these things. So the idea of community and the idea of collaboration that I've already alluded to, right? Teachers kind of coming together to engage in shared ideas about linguistic justice. Speculative vision, so forward-thinking work, but also building on the past, so taking inspiration from the past. Building critical language awareness into teaching. Putting issues of linguistic justice into dialogue with other forms of injustice, as per the principles of cross-movement solidarity. Doing some contextually sensitive work, right, recognizing that linguistic variation is contextually sensitive. And crucially, some abolitionist theories of change, which focus on the dismantling and the redesign of systems rather than the modification of individuals. So one of the first things that we've done that we did as part of this collective work is do some speculative work on what linguistically just schools might look like. So speculative methodologies have kind of had very little headway in applied linguistics, mostly in educational research, but we found them to be really powerful ways of doing this. So envisioning and designing intergenerationally just futures. So speculative methodologies are a tool that pushes us to question the present, right, to imagine what is not yet, and to imagine what different worlds might look like, i.e. to imagine what linguistically just schools might look like. So speculative methodologies really push us to question existing injustices and think about how we might bring imagined worlds into being. So as part of that collective, we co-produced really two core documents. We had a manifesto for linguistic justice and a set of pedagogical principles. Those two documents were really key because we then used those as like a kind of baseline to like check in with ourselves as the project unfolded, right? How kind of close was the work that we were doing? How was it remaining true to that initial manifesto that we designed? In some cases, the manifesto hasn't come into being yet, but that's okay because we're recognizing that that social justice work is a long-term effort. Here's some of the teachers coming together in Manchester to co-design that manifesto and that set of pedagogical principles that were used as a baseline and a vision for designing linguistically just schools. So the manifesto for linguistic justice then, maybe you can't see on here, but has key things like abolishing the idea of standard English, right? So abolishing the idea of dominant linguistic hierarchies, which we know have been so central to people's linguistic oppression, challenging deficit thinking, community and group solidarity, challenging systems rather than changing individuals, drawing inspiration from the past. So like big picture thinking to think about what this big manifesto might look like. Here's an extract from the manifesto. So I think it's clear the kind of things that the stances that teachers are taking here. So highlighting the idea that linguistic injustice is not primarily about individual attitudes. We're not blaming individuals for holding these views, but we're instead focusing our attention on structures and the long-standing and very durable phenomenon of language ideologies. Thinking about the different ways that linguistic injustice surfaces in schools, and thinking about how we might challenge deficit thinking and build futures of linguistic justice, not just through kind of accepting and championing and celebrating linguistic variation, but about reimagining new forms of schooling and new structures which have their focus of dismantling dominant language ideologies. So a core part of that then was this kind of commitment that teachers made as part of that, which was refusing to change the way that people speak and instead changing the way that they listen. Right? The problem is not with the speaker, the problem is always with the listener. So shifting attention away from speakers and towards how those speakers are perceived was a really crucial part of the work. We built on the past. So we went to archives together. We took inspiration from previous linguistic justice efforts and located teachers' work within this really long history of linguistic justice activism. So here's a picture of the George Padmore Institute in North London. We visited that archive together. It's a kind of really central space in a history of black supplementary schools, of the Black Power movement, and long histories of anti-racist work within language education, where teachers explored some of those older materials from the 60s and the 70s, took inspiration from that, and really saw their work as something that was really in kind of long lineage and having kind of in dialogue with some of those older efforts. So Mawahib, one of the teachers in the collective, said this. She said she's kind of took this real energy right? She took this energy from knowing that people had been doing this kind of linguistic justice work for a long time. And that was important to her because it reminded her that what she was doing now was just building on a really established legacy, right? Taking inspiration from the past and knowing that people had engaged in similar efforts before. Like Mawahib then, all teachers express like this really kind of strong identity to seeing themselves as critical educators, right? To seeing themselves as language activists, which are really crucial in part of those anti-deficit efforts. Those activist identities that they saw then, those kind of very politicized and very critical identities that they took, often were often shaped by their own intersectional identity and often their own lived experience of linguistic discrimination. So Lucy, a black teacher who had experienced what Baker Bell called anti-black linguistic racism, right, so the policing of black language styles, says that for her, like those memories of deficit thinking that she'd experienced in school, right, the way that her language had been judged and stigmatized in classrooms, was now something that was really motivating her to take collective action in the work that she was doing as a teacher. So she was working with teachers and she was working with children who were very similar to her, often looked down upon in school, very similar kids like Benjamin, who I opened this talk with. And instead, what her teaching was focused on was seeing the beauty in their own language and getting them to recognize the validity and the legitimacy of their own language rather than the way that dominant narratives were framing them. So language activism then, this idea that Coombs and Penfield articulated back in 2012, we took inspiration from this. So this idea that language activism is this kind of energetic action, right, where language activists are people who are trying to actively intervene, to defend their multiple ways of using languages, often from the bottom up, often through these kind of grassroots efforts, through grassroots resistance, building something from below in order to push back against state-imposed efforts to control, suppress, or discourage certain uses of language. Critical language awareness then was really important as well. So critical language awareness frames that teachers need to think critically about who the beneficiaries of language policies and practices are and how those ideas have the capacity to maintain hierarchies of power. So we worked really closely with a cool artist, Wendy Wong, and Wendy did some really nice images that just helped to kind of capture and illustrate a lot of the children's experiences of language in schools, such as the idea that people felt that their language was being squashed, was being flattened, was being eradicated, was not welcome, was seen as deviant, which required some kind of change. So teachers use these kinds of images to kind of trigger conversations, of critical conversations with children in schools. So one teacher, Claire, who was really central to that work, and Claire was just the most amazing teacher. She was one of the teachers that was named on the grant, one of the co-authors of some publications in press. One of the things that she did was design a unit on linguistic prejudice for 11-year-olds, right? So you had 11 and 12-year-olds talking critically about the relationship between language, race, class, power, in efforts to undo and reject dominant linguistic categories and ideologies, which were often positioning those children as inferior. So Claire said things like this. She said, like, in my teaching, she insists on those critical questions, right? So she doesn't just take those ideologies and those categories in language to be politically neutral, but she pushes children to think about, well, who's getting to decide what counts as correct, right? Or who's getting to decide what counts as standard or non-standard or appropriate or inappropriate or whatever. And she says those questions would always be really productive because it's always pushing students to think about how those categories are really just socially constructed categories that are primarily designed by people in power. A bit of a warning about critical language awareness then. I think it's important to note that critical language awareness, yes, is cool and yes, it's important, but that's never something that's going to dismantle broader systems of intersectional oppression in and by itself. So whilst critical language awareness rejects that the idea of education is simply just to add standard language repertoires into the existing practices of marginalized children, it still pushes back, and we still want to push back against this idea that marginalized communities, well, will always face ascribed deficiency and stigmatization, regardless of whether their language appears to correspond to dominant forms. So, on that, our efforts must instead be focused on developing new systems and new goals, which, yes, allow marginalized children to think about the relationship between language and power, and yes, allow them to bring their whole linguistic identities into school and have that validated, but at the same time must always be pushing for the transformation of inherently unjust systems and the dismantling of ideologies as part of that. So as Charity Hoodley and Mallison say, there's no linguistic justice without social justice more broadly. Linguistic justice efforts must always take place in dialogue with and in connection with other struggles for social justice. So put simply then, linguistic stigma, linguistic privilege, linguistic marginalisation always emerge from broader structures of stigma, marginalisation and privilege. So focusing on language is not unimportant, but as Flores and Chaparro say, critical language awareness is always going to be insufficient for addressing the root causes of marginalisation, given that minoritized speakers will always be minoritized in school as long as they're devalued members of society. So we must put anti-linguistic discrimination efforts always into dialogue with broader anti-stigma campaigning and cross-movement organising. That was what a lot of the work that teachers did when they were engaging in linguistic justice efforts then. So lots of teachers refused to just talk about this as an isolated act about language, but talked about linguistic justice as being connected to other forms of social injustice, like racial justice, gender injustice, and disability justice. So Claire, again, had this big campaign where her school was actively involved in anti-racism. The school had made this big commitment to anti-racism that put students and teachers at the forefront of those efforts. And Claire's linguistic justice work was very much part of those broader efforts around anti-racism. So the work that she was doing in her teaching was making connections between linguistic injustice and racial injustice. By far the most efficient linguistic justice efforts that we saw then as part of that collective were those that, yes, drew on those principles of cross-movement solidarity, but crucially were ones where it had guaranteed support from management, where managers, where head teachers, where governors were very supportive of those efforts and gave teachers time, resources and money to put those linguistic justice efforts into place. Let me just skip forward this slide in the interest of time. So teachers are always invested in transformative change then. And I think just coming back to this idea about theories of change, we know that linguistic injustice doesn't materialize through individual sets of beliefs and biases. So we know then that just simply educating individual minds to be more kind of tolerant of linguistic variation is always something that's simply going to leave structural barriers and unjust systems both intact and unaddressed. Instead, a transformative theory and an abolitionist theory says and starts from the premise that unjust systems aren't somehow broken. They're not somehow flawed, but they're working exactly as they are designed to do so. So no amount of tweaking those systems is ever going to bring about meaningful change. So abolitionist theories of change are instead a long-term, productive and creative and hopeful project which have this long-term goal of dismantling oppressive ideologies and designing new forms of schooling and indeed education from the ground up, often in participation with teachers. And that work is taking place. So in England, there's a whole cluster of really amazing and cool abolitionist organisations, such as Class 13 and No More Exclusions, who are showing us that transformative work is possible by taking an explicitly anti-deficit approach to their work to redesign curricula, redesign schools to be actively anti-deficit, including in how language pedagogies, assessments and curricula get circulated into classrooms. So coming towards the end then, I think it's important to stress that teachers alone shouldn't have responsibility for dismantling structural inequalities, and indeed they can't dismantle structural inequalities by themselves. But like many teachers before them, they do have a really core and crucial effort to play in exposing how language is part of systemic injustices more broadly. So those efforts, as I hope I've shown, must go simply beyond validating and affirming stigmatized language practices, but put issues of linguistic injustice into dialogue with broader social justice movements and efforts. If we know that linguistic discrimination is something structural, then the same perspective should be taken, therefore, for anti-language discrimination efforts. And finally, if we take linguistic discrimination as a design feature of schools, then we can take it as something that can be designed out. So, designing out deficit thinking about language, then, might involve the following. It might involve abolitionist methodologies, which focus their efforts not simply on changing individual minds, but on radically dismantling and designing new systems. It might take the form of academic-teacher collaborations, which enable grassroots change and enable cross-movement solidarity efforts to take place. It requires us to do some unconventional thinking about language, which unplans and actively rejects dominant language ideologies and dichotomies and categories in language. And I like the idea of slow linguistics that Penny Eckert and Emma Moore were talking about recently. The idea that ethnographic work in linguistics can push us to attend to the intricate, dexterous, creative language practices of marginalized kids and how schools often fail to recognize these. And finally, I'd like to pose that we should build on the past and speculate about the future in order to critique the present. And I'll leave you with one of my most famous quotes and ways of thinking about language and the rejection of standard language ideologies, which comes from who else but Audre Lorde, the black feminist thinker working in the early 80s, that said the master's tools were clearly never designed to serve the oppressed. They weren't designed to do that. So what she's saying here then is that we must recognize that adherence to linguistic standards will never protect marginalized communities, and that theories of change which ask them to change their language are always going to be deeply flawed. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And now, yeah, we have first question.
I have an Eastern European question. Could you elaborate how do the children of Polish or Ukrainian immigrants who have not been integrated or assimilated yet compared to Black Caribbeans in this general hierarchy of deficiency?
Yeah, I mean, black kids in England schools occupy a particularly stigmatized position, as a long history, of course, with the marginalisation of black communities. I mean, multilingual children in England schools, there's a dominant discursive deficit around multilingual children in England schools. And education policy hasn't helped that through forms of teacher education, which have really historically been inadequate in preparing teachers to recognise multilingual abilities, policy that consistently has framed multilingualism as exhibiting as some kind of linguistic deficit. So they occupy a different position to Black Caribbean and Black African schools in England schools, but they're often still institutionally perceived as somehow of linguistic deficit and in need of some kind of remediation.
Yeah, Mart?
Definitely, we have to look into past to understand the current situation in our educational stage. And when we speak about deficit theories, and then we have to go past some half a century, starting with Bernstein and others in the States, and afterwards several counter theories emerged, as we know, ebonics and linguistic imperialism with Philipson and Pennycook and Dasgupta and Tollefson and others, and then more explicit colonial theories, and so on, together with critical awareness and also critical discourse analysis as a suitable toolbox for linguistic tasks in this stage. But let's make some thought experiment. I'm just elaborating the previous question. When we place this Benjamin into some Estonian school, will it change any or augment any of your arguments in this case, as Estonian teachers seemingly do held the same values as English teachers? What would you augment or change or modify in this case?
Yeah, thanks. That's an interesting question. I mean, I don't know much about Estonian schools. I guess my response would be that the ideologies will always be persistent because they're global ideologies. I think what's probably unique about England, and I'm interested to learn more about how Estonian teachers are positioned, but England's teachers are arguably one of the most monitored, surveilled, controlled teachers in the world, in the sense of how they are positioned to reproduce ideologies that are dominant within policy. There's lots of interlocking mechanisms that put teachers in England under various levels of pressure to exhibit complicity with state policies. And those policies can often have quite material effects both on a teacher's ability to do their job, but also on a school's ability to be judged by those ranking systems as well. So I would argue that whilst the ideologies might be similar across different geographical contexts, when we're doing critical language work, especially in education, we always have to think about the different policy mechanisms in which individual teachers in individual countries are positioned into. So maybe Estonia has a system where teachers are placed under various interlocking forms of surveillance and control. I don't know, I'd be interested to hear more about that. But in England, certainly, yeah, they can be quite hostile spaces for teachers, even those teachers who want to push back. So that idea of cracks in the system is quite important, I think, because it recognizes that those teachers always work within a very, very difficult system. But I always like to remain hopeful. There's always spaces for resistance, but locating those spaces can be really difficult to do so.
Right. I come from kind of a perspective where I taught English as a second language in Finnish schools for a couple of years. And I was wondering, do you see any role for written standard English, sort of maybe removed from received pronunciation or kind of any particular accepted pronunciation? What happens when you teach English as a second language is that a lot of the students, they may listen to rap music, or then they go to the internet, or they watch Hollywood films, and these forms have kind of covered prestige. And the way I reasoned it and the way I explained to them is that this is school. Here we learn standard language so you can function in these registers. Like if you're writing a job application, you're not going to use slang forms in your own language or in English, and something which is fine for the register of rap lyrics is fine for a register of rap lyrics, but this is school, and sort of you learn sort of the more formal registers. Sort of the idea of abolishing standard language completely kind of ignores that it does have some functions, especially if it's just written standard language.
Yeah, I get this question quite a lot. I mean, I guess like my response to that would be, well, like you mentioned, that someone's ability to produce standard written English is the kind of key tool to getting them a job and therefore experiencing social mobility. Like, I recognize that that might have a role to play, but there's a real danger if you isolate the acquisition of standard written English as a kind of key and isolated tool to do that, then that's quite a problematic theory of change for me. Because again, it's isolating language as this kind of single mode and tool of social mobility. For kids like Benjamin and kids like another kids in that study, like no matter what they did with their written standard English or their alleged ability to use standard English, there was always going to be other structural factors that were preventing them from experiencing social mobility in the way that more privileged kids didn't do. So the danger is that through that argument, I think we risk framing the acquisition of standard written English as a kind of like a panacea for social mobilities, which I think as critical sociolinguists we would all want to question and push back on.
Thank you. I believe 2 questions.
Yes, thank you for your talk. I was actually thinking the same thing about the standardized English, because as an English teacher, we need to assess language and we need to have standards according to which or based on which we actually assess language. I was, as you were talking, I was kind of thinking whether this standardized English, then would one solution be to kind of look at it as this one type of language that people should perhaps kind of study, learn, acquire separately, so they have their English and then they have the standard English? Because if we think about language, learning English, then lots of countries, for example here in Estonia, we generally have to learn English in order to actually participate in the global academic field. So without knowing English, we would be marginalized ourselves. So in that sense, it does, like, knowing standard English does actually give us power in some ways. Thank you.
Yeah, I recognise that it has a role to play, but I think, again, like similar to my response to the previous question, there's a risk that if we isolate the acquisition of that as a kind of sole tool for success and as a kind of reference point for social progress, then that's quite a dangerous narrative. I guess, like, we should always question on, well, whose standard is standard English or standard Estonian, whatever, based on? Like, whose language practices is that benchmark based on? And in England, for sure, history tells us that so-called standard English is based on the language practices of the most privileged members of society. I mean, April Baker-Bell, who I quoted in the talk, she and linguists like Geneva Smitherman, John Rickford, Carter Woodson, etc., all the way back in the kind of 70s, argue really that the phrase standard English shouldn't really exist at all because it doesn't represent a particularly linguistically or politically accurate category. So Baker-Bell says, well, what we should call it is white mainstream English, right? We should call it a category which is much more reflective of its racialized and its political status. In fact, some teachers in the study were using that language. So we had some teachers in the study that were saying, no, we're not going to use the phrase standard English in these lessons. We're going to call it what it is, which is white mainstream English. And even that kind of very easy terminological shift just like push students into thinking a little bit more critically about language, which was the core aim of the project.
Okay, thank you. Now, last question.
Yeah. How significant is the problem of language discrimination at different school levels?
What do you mean by school levels, sorry?
Primary, elementary, high school.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, most of my work has been looking at secondary schools. So in England, that's the ages of 11 to 16. But if we take language discrimination to be something that's deeply wedded and a product of language ideology, then those very same language ideologies persist in earlier forms of schooling as well. Some of the more recent work that I'm doing is looking at very young students' kind of first contact with dominant language ideologies when they enter into formal schooling. So that's at the age of 4 in England. And what we're finding from that work is that a student's kind of first encounter with a dominant language ideology in school happens within the first weeks of formal schooling, right? So right from the ages of 4, when they start school in September, they're met with very dominant narratives about language, which are often rooted in deficit thinking. So kind of watch this space, but my feeling is that discrimination and stigma and indeed ideologies persist across all school levels.
Okay, thank you, and thank you for the questions. So we want to thank you by treating you, Ian.
Oh, thank you.
And thank you for coming here.
That's very kind. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thanks.
And
thank you.